This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Ian Dale.
Hello, very good evening. It's Cross Question on LBC. It's 8 o'clock. With me on my panel tonight, in the studio with me, let me tell you, I have Justine Greening, former Education Secretary, Transport Secretary, International Development Secretary. She's also focusing on levelling up goals. We'll probably talk about that during the programme. Owen Jones is with me, also in the studio, Guardian columnist and author. Joining us from Leicester Square, our studio there, Lord Andrew Adonis. I called you earlier, Andrew, the Rejoiner-in-Chief. I hope that's a title which you will rejoice in. And we have the antithesis of the Rejoiner-in-Chief, former Conservative MP and former Brexit Party MEP Anne Widdecombe with us as well. They're ready to take your calls, 0345 6060973. And of course, you can watch us on Global Player on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk, the YouTube channel or Facebook or Twitter feeds.
Call 0345 6060973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Ian Dale. This is LBC.
Well, can I say how wonderful it is to have you both in the studio? We were hoping to have everybody in the studio, but that pleasure will have to wait for another month. Let's go to our first question. It's from David in Paddington. David, what would you like to ask?
Good evening, panel. Yes, I'd just like to know, in light of Dominic Cummings' evidence, and as he was a witness in the room and thousands of people died, shouldn't A, Matt Hancock resign, and B, shouldn't Keir Starmer be demanding he resigns as so many people died?
Well, Dominic Cummings was doing a Q&A today on his Substack page, charging £10 for it, I gather. Interesting decision, that. Owen Jones, let's come to you first.
What, do you honestly think the powerful should accept consequences for their actions? I mean, this is ridiculous. What do you think this is, a democracy? 150,000 people sent to their premature graves, one of the worst death tolls on the face of the earth, one of the worst economic consequences on earth. And you think powerful people in government should have to face the consequences? I think, I'm touched by this trust in decency and doing the honourable thing. I mean, as for Matt Hancock, clearly, I don't agree with Boris Johnson on that anything, except for the fact that the way he described Matt Hancock, which I can't use the exact terms because it's quite flowery on your radio station, but I would agree that Matt Hancock, of course, was useless in a terrible way. The discharging of vulnerable patients from hospitals into care homes, which seeded the virus in a very vulnerable sector. 1 in every 14 care home patients died in the first 3 months of the pandemic, a horrifying statistic. Of course he should resign, but you're also, I'm afraid, accepting something else slightly naive, which is for the opposition to do its job. And I'm afraid at the moment, the official opposition has decided to vacate its democratically given role, which is to provide a real alternative to the government. They don't ask for resignations. They don't offer an alternative about how they would have stopped the pandemic being one of, as I said, the worst. We are one of the worst affected countries on earth because I'm afraid Keir Starmer has failed, alas, to do his job. What? So I know I've been a bit sarcastic there because I agree entirely with the caller, but I'm sorry to say that the government have been allowed to get away with locking down too late repeatedly, reopening without a functioning test and trace system, seeding the care home sector with the virus, and that's on them, but it's also on the opposition because they should have actually stood up to them, but they've been useless. Sorry to rant, but that's what's happened.
Why do you think that last Wednesday, at I think about 10:30, Dominic Cummings released all of this stuff about Matt Hancock, and why do you think Keir Starmer didn't raise that at Prime Minister's questions?
You know what? Well, he's so forensic, isn't he? That's what we were told. Yeah, look, I'm frustrated. I know a lot of people go, oh, come on, Owen, he's the leader of the opposition. Come on, we've got to unite against the Tories. I agree with that. But what are you supposed to do when the leader of the opposition just lets the government get away with absolutely everything, including being handed a massive open goal, which he could have kicked? And, yeah, sure, he only had half an hour, but anyone who's able to think on his feet, which you'd expect the former Crown Prosecution Service head to be able to do in those circumstances, should have done that. And the reason I'm angry and frustrated is so many people across this country have lost relatives before their time, myself included. It was always going to be bad, but we didn't need to have one of the worst death tolls on earth. And I think the opposition should have done infinitely more to hold the government to account. They didn't. They let the government get away with it, and look at the terrible consequences. It's depressing. It's bleak.
Justine, you probably know Matt Hancock better than any of us on the programme today. Do you think he should resign?
I think that there should be a proper inquiry to really get to the bottom of exactly how the pandemic was dealt with. I think if the Prime Minister had significant concerns about his Health Secretary's ability to deliver the strategy that they needed during the pandemic to save lives, he should have replaced him with someone he had more confidence in. I mean, going back on what Owen said...
Would you have done that? I mean, from what you know, do you think that Dominic Cummings is on the money here regarding Matt Hancock?
Well, I don't know enough, let's face it. But then I hardly think Dominic Cummings is Mr. Reliable when it comes to, shrewd judgment during the COVID pandemic. And I think that in the end, only Boris Johnson really knows whether he should have remained in that role. I do think we all have to understand it was a very, very genuinely very difficult time. I dealt with the Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone, and we had to run to get ahead of that. In fact, I worked with Chris Whitty, who was my DFID Chief Scientific Officer. So I've got some sympathy for how hard it was. But if Boris Johnson really had such concerns with Matt Hancock, then he should replace him, actually, because of what was at stake. As for Keir Starmer, I agree. I don't know how much more of an open goal you have to be. It's like the political ball hadn't just been pitched up conveniently to the right height. It's literally been held stationary in the air, and all you had to do was hit it. I mean, literally just before PMQs, it had PMQ question today, right now, stamped all over it, flashing neon lights. And I think when Labour look back on Keir Starmer's leadership and the moments when they probably reached conclusions that he wasn't going to have what it took to ever win them an election, I think that will be one of the moments they look at.
A text here from somebody who doesn't give their name. Isn't asking for resignations an empty and lazy kind of rhetoric? Ditto apologies. More important is demanding a proper change in policy. Anne Widdecombe, I don't think you were in Parliament with Matt Hancock. How do you answer the question, should he resign?
Well, first of all, I agree with Justine when she says there should be a proper inquiry. And indeed, we've been promised a proper inquiry. And I think that while you're in the middle of handling something like this, it's probably best to concentrate on the issues to hand and to worry about the analysis in retrospect afterwards. So I would hope to see a full and frank inquiry, and one which really does put pressure on all those involved. And I think that is necessary. On the Keir Starmer point, I couldn't agree more. It's amazing. I hardly ever agree with Owen Jones. But I certainly agree on this one. I think that initially, right at the start of the crisis, Keir Starmer was perfectly correct to back the government in what it was doing, because there is a long tradition that if you have a genuine national emergency, government and opposition do try to work together. But this has now been going on for far longer than would justify that. And yet, as Owen says, he's come up with no alternatives. He's come up with no counter proposals. And I think the result in Chesham and Amersham, when you've got the opposition party, the major opposition party, losing its deposit in a midterm by-election, probably, I think, suggests that what Owen and I are saying is reflected throughout the population.
You've done very well not to mention Matt Hancock in a question about Matt Hancock.
Well, I thought I had answered it, because what I said to you was, I think that while you're handling the matter, you've got to concentrate on the issues. But afterwards, I want to see a full, thorough inquiry. And I did use the phrase which puts pressure on all those involved. OK, Andrew Adonis.
Well, I don't think Hancock's going to go, because if Hancock goes, then Boris Johnson needs to go too. I'd be perfectly happy, of course, to see a change of government. But in the real world, I don't think that's going to happen soon. Do I think he should go? Yes. Do I think he's going to go? No. However, the more pressing issue at the moment is that the government's now advertising for a head of the NHS, which is as important as Matt Hancock's job, because Simon Stevens, the head of the NHS, is the person who operationally
just on that,
runs
we might have a question on that in a second. So I don't know where you were going with that, Andrew.
Where I was going was the idea that Dido Harding, who is the person, remember, responsible for the 15 billion fiasco over test and trace, the idea that she should now, by Matt Hancock and Boris Johnson, be made head of the NHS, which is, her only qualification one can see for the job is that she's married to a Tory MP and is a Tory peer. She sits on the opposite benches to me in the House of Lords, I think is absolutely monstrous. And I very much hope that with huge sway that you've got, Ian, as one of the leading broadcasters in the country who brings the voice of the people to the heart of power, I hope you'll be bringing all your callers in as to why we shouldn't intensify the fiasco that we've had over the last year by making one of the people responsible for it, Dido Harding, the actual head of the NHS. I
did actually say we have a question on this, Andrew, so if we can just sort of move off that for a moment. In fact, let's go back to David in Paddington and get your view on your own question, David.
Yes, I just think that if you're going to have I think the opposition party, the Labour Party, have now got to call it a day. They need someone with a spine running that party because it was an open goal, as one of your panel said, and they've got to get someone like Andy Burnham running the place because they've got time now before the next election to get someone in, get Starmer to put his hand up and say, look, I'm not a leader, and move on.
Does Andy Burnham float your boat, Owen?
Lovely eyelashes. I interviewed him the other day up in Batley and Spen. I think Andy's a lovely guy, but I think and I think, lots of people find him very charismatic. I think he would be the first to say he did run for leader twice, so this would be third time lucky. But I think the issue is and I am answering the question, but this is how. Because the Keir Starmer experiment has been a really fascinating experiment in the Labour Party having no vision whatsoever about what it wants to do with political power. And they thought just by looking competent, he's a Sir, Knight of the Realm, head of the state bureaucracy, people would go really competent in contrast to Boris Johnson. Instead of, their dividing line was competence rather than vision and values. And it hasn't worked. It's been a terrible failure. And my worry is whoever succeeds Keir Starmer has to prove they have a very, very clear vision for what they want to do with the country. And Andy Burnham is someone who's obviously done a great job in Manchester because he won a landslide there, because he stood up to the government over COVID-19. He brought the buses into public ownership, very popular. But he'd have to prove that he's got a vision, because in 2015... the reason he didn't become leader of the Labour Party is he'd been the darling of the grassroots beforehand. Do you remember he was Shadow Health Secretary, NHS, always good to get to the kind of soul of the Labour Party. But then he launched his leadership bid in Ernst & Young, which is a accountancy firm that specialises in tax avoidance, and shifted his pitch. I
think they would refute that.
Well, no, they do deal with it's legal tax avoidance, so it's not defamatory. Don't worry, I've had that legal repeatedly. The thing with Andy Burnham is I really like the guy. He's done a great job in Greater Manchester, but he'd have to set out a clear vision for the country, which he didn't do last time.
If Labour loses Batley and Spen, are you one of these people on the left who say, well, that's it, he's got to go?
Are you kidding? Yes, you can't lose two. Batley and Spen and Hartlepool were kept by Jeremy Corbyn in two elections. Actually, in 2017, over half the electorate in both those seats voted Labour. That was 4 years ago. Oppositions in the last 50 years before Hartlepool had only lost an opposition to the government twice. If he doubles that in the space of 2 months, the idea he should stay as leader of the opposition, continuing to allow the government to get away with anything,
Jeremy
is
Corbyn
ludicrous.
Stayed as leader of the opposition when they lost the Copeland by-election.
Well, actually, at the time, quite notoriously, I don't know if you remember this, I actually did call for his resignation. Quite a lot of people are very angry with me on the left for having done so. And the point I would say, the difference is, Jeremy Corbyn won his first by-elections. The first one was in 2015, when Michael Meacher died. He increased Labour's majority.
Yeah, but that was a seat the Labour Party already held. The point is Copeland was one that they lost.
Yeah, but that's the point. The point I'm making is Keir Starmer lost his first ever by-election. If he loses two by-elections, which Jeremy Corbyn did not do, incidentally, of course he has to go. Otherwise, the government can continue to just be able to get away with anything they want.
Andrew Adonis, you were tweeting after the Liberal Democrat by-election things that were friendly to them. I know you used to be a member of the Liberal Democrats. Do you think that Keir Starmer should go if they lose the Batley and Spen by-election?
Yes, I do. I agree. I agree that he should go if he loses, because he's not an electorally viable proposition. But the votes haven't been counted in Batley and Spen yet, and those of us who have seen elections, including those of us who fought them recently and lost them, know that until you actually see the votes, it's best to wait and see what the voters do. We didn't remember we hadn't expected the voters to go Lib Dem in the way they did at Chesham and Amersham last Thursday. I didn't see any serious commentator who said the Lib Dems were going to win it. I mean, I don't even think you, and you're one of our most distinguished, Ian, I don't think you were saying they were going to.
Enough of it.
So maybe Keir will
Such a flirt.
Maybe Keir will pull a rabbit out of a hat on Thursday, and we all hope he does.
I feel that we've achieved something in this hour. We have Owen Jones and Anne Widdecombe united, and we have Owen Jones and Andrew Adonis united. So it's just Justine to go, really. Justine Greening, Owen Jones, Andrew Adonis and Anne Widdecombe are with us. Let's go to our long-anticipated question about Dido Harding from Chris in Richmond. Hello, Chris.
Good evening, panel. Good evening, Ian. Were Dido Harding's comments about reducing dependence on foreign workers in the NHS populist dog whistle politics or pragmatism?
This is quite an interesting one, isn't it? Because it in a sense, from a PR point of view, you think, well, why on earth did she say that? But then there is a point to this, isn't there, Anne Widdecombe, in that we are leeching workers from countries that actually need them for their own health services. Just to repeat the question, were Dido Harding's comments about foreign NHS workers dog whistle politics or pragmatism?
Well, I mean, the fact is that we have employed health workers from other countries for decades, and we've been importing labour rather than skilling our own. And that has been going on for a very long time under governments of both parties, and indeed under the coalition. So there's actually nothing unusual about it. What is unusual about it is that Dido Harding has actually put it into words and has spelled it out. And yes, of course, and I have said this for many years, one of the big problems about importing other people's health workers is that, yes, you solve your own problems, but very often you're taking them, particularly in the case of third world health workers, you're taking them from countries that would really benefit from their skills. But the answer to that has got to be that we skill our own workforce and recruit rather better. And successive governments just failed to do that. And while we're on the subject of the NHS, by the way, it doesn't matter who's going to run the show, unless we ask some very fundamental questions about how on earth we're going to go on funding something that is a bottomless pit and still serving people and making sure that people get the health care they need. Until we have that very basic discussion, which I've been banging on about now for about 3 decades, it doesn't matter who runs it.
Andrew Adonis, you've partly answered this question already, but what about the fact that about her comments today?
Well, they're fundamentally hypocritical, aren't they? Because this is the government, which she is an active supporter of. She's actually a Conservative peer, which has just cut the international aid budget by a third. And a large part of that budget went for training professionals, including health workers, in developing countries so that they would stay and so that they could have decent health systems in their own countries. Also, education systems. You know, the G7, which we had last week, with Boris Johnson down in that bay in Cornwall, was going on about educating women, and he said it was a huge priority and he'd put resources into it, having just slashed resources for educating girls and women in developing countries. So, what you've got with this government, as always, is a load of populist hypocrisy. They say on the one hand that they want more homegrown health workers, and I agree with that. I think we should be seeking to give everybody who possibly can, who's gone through the education system in this country, the opportunity to become a health worker. But they then say that they want to ban health workers from coming into the country, which must be the implication of what Dido Harding is saying, which I think would, in practice, be almost impossible to achieve.
When did they say they wanted to ban it?
Well, how else is she going to see that we don't have foreign health workers working in the NHS? I mean, is she just willing the end without the means? How is she actually going to do Because there's a massive magnet
I think it's a stretch
effect
to say that either she or the government want to ban foreign workers.
In that case, she's declaring an objective without a means to achieve it. Because in practice, people want to come and work in the health services. They want to get qualifications because they're very highly rated health professional qualifications in this country, and then obviously a large number of them then stay and work here. But the best way of keeping them back in and working in the countries from which they come, in many cases, is to provide proper education, training and opportunities there. And that's why the international aid budget is so important. And the government's, just as I say, cut that by a third.
Is it wrong to say... Go on, Anne.
Yeah, Andrew. I mean, you've said quite rightly, that over here you get a very, very good education in healthcare. And what bothers me is that people come over here, they get that education, and then they do stay, instead of taking the skills back and deploying them where they are most desperately needed. And that provides another conundrum, because quite obviously we want to get benefit from the people that we're educating. But if we actually do our duty in terms of poorer countries, then we would be encouraging those workers to return.
But I think, Anne, you support the cut in international aid, don't you? Which, of course, is one of the things that's going to mean that even more health workers and those who want to become health workers will end up leaving developing countries and wanting to come here. So we do need to be coherent about this, don't we?
Andrew, just give me now your source for saying that I wanted to cut the foreign aid budget. Just give me that source.
Well, if you don't, so I thought you did. If you don't, then, of course, we'd be able to... far more of them would be able to stay. I'm very sorry. And if you stand by the 0.7% and want to keep it.
What I have always said, and said quite regularly in my excellent Express column every Wednesday, is that what matters.
Sorry, I'm not a regular reader.
Is not so much having a spending target, which just means that in March you spend on nonsense in order to meet the target. It's much more important to have objectives. And one of the things I have been saying for a long time and have never actually got an answer to is this.
So do you want to cut it or not?
No, let me finish this. The West, in general, has spent trillions over the last few decades on overseas aid, and yet you've still got, Andrew, vast tracts of the third world without a pure water supply.
Okay.
Well, I'm now mystified as to what Anne's policy is, whether she wants to cut it or not. Maybe she can answer the question.
Now, there are two other panellists with us here, so, I mean, this is all very, very interesting, and I've enjoyed it.
Owen Jones.
Well, you're going to hear a bit more in a second.
There are two
never
enough.
enough.
We haven't heard much from Justine, if you want to be...
And you love it. You love it, and you love hearing from me.
We are going to go to Justine right now. Thank you for helping in my chairmanship, Anne. Justine, do you think that Dido... Do you think that Dido Harding's...
like being back in the House of Commons.
Oh, my goodness. I'm losing control. Do you think Dido Harding's comments about foreign NHS workers are dog whistle politics or pragmatism?
I don't think, to be honest, I don't think she should be doing a public campaign to become head of the NHS. I don't think that's appropriate.
I don't know the context of
that's
what
almost the
why
first
these
problem
comments
I
were
had with
made.
this. The second issue for me is that I think it's fine for the NHS to have people working in it who aren't originally from this country. I think it helps spread knowledge. I think it does give people experience. The issue we have is when the NHS becomes overly reliant on staffing from people from entirely different countries, and we're not able to really make sure that we can man the NHS ourselves. That comes and you can't have that approach when at the same time you're a government that is pledging to constantly bring down immigration. So effectively you need to have a joined up policy. I think the first thing you actually need to work out is what's a 21st century approach for the NHS look like. It should be much more about prevention rather than cure and waiting for people to end up ill and getting into hospitals. That's why the social care debate today also matters. But at that stage, then you can work out who the healthcare professionals are that you need. And, you know, I spent a long time leading DEFID. I'm really proud, actually, of the work that we do helping healthcare workers get trained overseas. But I think there is an issue that we do almost certainly bring far too many of them over to this country and rely on them when actually they are badly needed at home.
Yeah, but it's a bit galling hearing that from you, because you did vote to cut the nurse bursary in the government which you served, and one of the reasons we ended up with domestic shortages of nurses, and there's still massive domestic shortages of nurses, is because your government slashed the nurse bursary in this country. I mean, look, if we're going to talk, by the way, and the only argument I ever had any sympathy with this is the idea that we were taking away medical staff from countries that needed them. But I looked into it because people corrected me. And actually what happens is it's a mutually beneficial thing, because those staff gain experience here and often return to their countries to help in their domestic their domestic health systems. And the other point is, look, I think this just sums it all up. Yes, it is dog whistle politics. The problem with the NHS is people like Dido Harding. She oversaw the calamity of test and trace. If we were to compare test and trace to the vaccine rollout, what's the difference? Test and trace was run by private contractors like Serco. The vaccine programme was run by the public sector. Which one worked and which one failed?
The vaccines were developed by
test and trace.
Pharmaceutical companies.
If we're talking about the rollout, we're talking about the rollout. And if you want to get into that argument, Big Pharma is completely dependent on state research. Billions, trillions of pounds across the years have been spent by the state, which then Big Pharma then turn into profit. That's a separate argument, but I'm happy to have it. The whole point is, the vaccine rollout was run and manned by the public sector. The NHS, I'm afraid, again, under the coalition government, also under New Labour, and also since, you've got the extension of the private sector. Those are the people we should be angry at, not nurses and doctors from across the world. My relatives, I'm sure many of yours, have been looked after and cared for in their bleakest and most difficult moments by people from all over the world, and we should be proud of that. And as I've said, they benefit those countries because they go back and take the experiences and skills they get from the NHS back to their own countries. But what we should be angry at is that power in this country. If you are powerful and you oversee a national catastrophe, billions of pounds wasted on test and trace, you can still expect to be in the running to win our proudest national institution, the NHS. And that shows if you're powerful in this country, pretty much get away with anything. Do what you want. You can end up with the NHS handed to you on a plate.
If she had put it a different way and said, look, over the next 10 years, I think the 14%, I think, is the figure of foreign workers in the NHS. Over the next 10 years, we should be reducing that to something like 10% by training up more British people. Would that be more acceptable to you?
It's just an arbitrary figure. It's only 14% anyway, but 14%, by the way, without which the NHS would completely collapse.
Well, that was my point.
We've got a massive problem with vacancies. There's massive nursing shortages. And as I've said, yes, of course, I want the government to I want them to pay nurses properly for a start. It's insulting at the moment they've not been given a proper pay rise. They should get 12%, not the measly real terms pay cut they've got. If we pay nurses properly in this country, more people from this country will want to become nurses in the first place.
Chris in Richmond, what would you like to say on your own question?
Well, I think that Dido Harding it is about populism, frankly. She's obviously, as Justine said, she's pitching for the job. She knows that she's going to appeal to Boris Johnson's more a greater control over immigration. But as Owen Jones has said, we've got a massive staff shortage, 38,000, 1 in 10 vacancies. But I do want to correct Owen on what he said about the vaccines. I work in pharma, and look, all you have to do is look up what AstraZeneca have done. They are not making any profit on the vaccine, and I think you have to make that very clear, Owen, because that's
but the public sector was instrumental in the research that led to the vaccine. It's a very, very important point to make. Honestly, look up Professor Mariana Mazzucato, brilliant economist. She's written about this extensively. Without state-funded research, Big Pharma would not exist and develop those medicines.
Tanya in Valence in France says, neither you nor your panel picked up on Owen Jones's reference to Andy Burnham's eyelashes. If a man had said that about a woman, I'm fairly certain Mr. Jones would object. Perhaps you'd like to clarify what he meant.
I'm sorry for objectifying Andy Burnham on your show. Look, there's nothing wrong with describing Andy Burnham's eyelashes.
Yes, but there's nothing wrong either when describing a woman's eyelashes.
I think there's.
How would you describe Anne Widdecombe's eyelashes?
There's a difference in power dynamic between men and women, and men having a jokey little description of each other's physical appearances. It's very different because women are constantly objectified. I can't believe this has been turned into a serious discussion.
I think we have learnt there that Owen Jones is the antithesis of woke. Justine Greening, Owen Jones, Anne Widdecombe, Andrew Adonis answering your questions. 0345 6060 973. Hope you're watching us on Global Player 2 or the LBC YouTube channel, Facebook page, Twitter feed or website. Now here's a question which I'm sure is going to unite our panel. It's from Milan in Ashford. Hello, Milan.
Hello, Ian.
Hi.
So the panel, Brexit was supposed to be great for all with no downsides, but disappointingly, we've got Johnson & Co lying, various sectors expressing their dismay, Johnson and Frost not understanding what they agreed in the protocol. So does the panel agree that Brexit has been a disaster thus far, and should expectations be adjusted?
Somebody complained to me earlier on Twitter that, you've got 3 Remainers and 1 Brexiteer on the panel. And I said to them, I don't choose my panel by the Brexit vote any longer. I used to try and do 2-2, but it's gone. And but I rather wish I now had got two on this panel in some ways. Andrew Adonis, I'm going to come to you, the rejoiner-in-chief, as I described you earlier. You are convinced that Britain should rejoin the EU. We know that you were totally against Brexit, but has it been as disastrous so far as you thought it might be?
Well, the bigger challenge that the country faces at the moment is COVID-19, and I think most listeners would want us to get through that and get most people vaccinated, back into jobs, social events happening again and all of that before we revisit what we're going to do with what is clearly a disastrous Brexit deal. I mean, we can already see that our trade with the EU is down, whereas our trade with the rest of the countries, with the rest of the world beyond the EU, has been going up. So it's definitely the case that it's a disaster. Your caller's analysis is completely correct. But you have to do one thing at a time in life, don't you, in terms of big things? And we need to get the country moving again after COVID-19. And I'm keen that we're as united as possible on that, because after all, in principle, there should be no difference between us on getting people vaccinated, getting schools open and functioning properly, getting the backlog of nearly 10 million operations that there'll be in the NHS within a few months, unless we can really turn this around, getting all of that sorted out. And then let's see what we can do to unpick all the damage done in the Brexit deal a year ago. I would just add one other point, though, which is that your caller mentioned Northern Ireland and the situation there. That is more urgent because at the moment you've got the government refusing to implement the agreement that Boris Johnson made with the EU on Northern Ireland, and that could lead to a real ongoing crisis there, and potentially the collapse of the Good Friday Agreement if we're not careful. So I think we need to move quicker in respect of Northern Ireland. But the rest of the deal, let's get COVID sorted out, let's get people back to work, back in schools, the backlog in the NHS dealt with, and then let's look at how we then start to unpick this developing Brexit crisis.
You and I are roughly the same age. Do you think that it's possible that within our respective lifetimes that we could rejoin the EU?
Yes, I'd be very surprised if we don't, because I think the reason we went into Europe, the British people aren't ideological and doctrinaire about these things. The reason we went into Europe in the 1970s is because we were falling so far behind France, Germany, the Netherlands. There's even, remember, in a famous year, the Sorpasso, where the Italian economy showed signs of overtaking Britain. This is the reason why we went into the common market, because we wanted to create a single large market for trading our goods. Margaret Thatcher, who was, I understand, Anne Widdecombe adores, Margaret Thatcher took this further to create a larger frictionless
all these assumptions you're
market.
Making about Anne Widdecombe tonight, Andrew.
Well, I'm trying to see that she has
right.
I'm trying to see she has a proper opportunity to defend Margaret Thatcher, because Margaret Thatcher is the one who then extended this market because she wanted a bigger market for British goods. That's the reason why we went in the 70s. And as our trade suffers and people become poorer and their jobs go, which is what is going to really matter to people, exactly those same forces will come to bear. And then, of course, all the lies. Remember, Brexit was done on the basis that it was supposed to be £350 million a week for the NHS. Do you remember that, Ian? I think people were saying that on your programmes.
I do remember
when
it, and I think Theresa May provided it.
Well, when they see that, in fact, their trade and their jobs are suffering, I think they'll be quite keen to get back in again.
Justine Greening.
Well, I always felt it was a mistake to say you'd got Brexit done, as it were, because it was obvious to me that Brexit is the political and economic rewiring of our country, and that it is going to take a very, very long time. And I think you see that in the fact that there are these initial agreements, that are initial attempts to try and make progress that thus far are not succeeding in the way clearly the government had hoped. My concern with all of this is the jobs that are on the line in the meantime, and the businesses that have been nurtured by the people who set them up, whether they're selling cheese, sausages, whatever else it is, and are now really struggling because we can't get those agreements in place. And I think Europe, the EU, does need to accept that we have left. I don't think it's helpful for people like President Macron to, I think, play hardball, which is through the prism of French presidential elections. Equally, I don't think it helps that David Frost seems to raise the temperature on discussions where actually what you need is to get people around the room and focused on the lives and the livelihoods that are at stake for not managing to work through some of these very, very difficult issues. But I think I agree with you, Brexit is done, in the sense that we've had that debate, we are on the other side of it, and we now all need to try and make sure it works as well as it can for Britain, both on trade, on our politics and our links with our wider EU neighbours, and also culturally, and making sure that people can go on holiday and do all of that stuff that actually really does matter to all of us, frankly. Being able to enjoy being part of this landmass that we call the EU and Europe.
And Widdicombe, I'm going to come to you last on this because I want you to respond to the points that the others have made. But Owen Jones, you were shaking your head when Andrew reckoned that we could join the EU in his or mine lifetime.
We've got to never, ever, ever reopen this debate in British politics, ever, ever again. I'm sorry, but look, I was one of those people lost in the no man's land. I was Eurosceptic from a left position, but campaigned to remain because I thought, despite my problems with the EU, which haven't changed, I thought we were better remaining in, fighting for reform and all the rest of it. I would have preferred that, but we lost. And what we ended up with, I'm afraid, is several years, and I have to say, having Anne Widdecombe and Lord Adonis, they've got many strong points, but British politics was essentially for several years those two factions yelling at each other. It was like being stuck at a dinner party where two of the guests have had pretty much a little bit too much booze, got overheated and started throwing things at each other. But it wasn't a dinner party you could walk out of. It was British politics for half a decade. And the idea we're going to reopen that, we didn't spend years talking about the housing crisis, about climate justice, about the climate emergency, about poverty, about public services. We were talking about the customs union. It was horrendous. And do you know what? The horrible scenes we saw in terms of the divisions that opened up in British society, communities, families, all divided, I hated every minute of it. And I think the best we can do now is just accept the referendum result and try to make Brexit work as best as possible. I do think Northern Ireland is a very important point, by the way, because it's completely ignored. We spent centuries doing over Ireland in this country and then just pretend it doesn't exist and isn't relevant. And actually, the Northern Ireland peace process was hard won. It stopped the deaths of over 3,000 people in the Troubles. So we've got to sort that out, but we've got to start on the basis we've accepted the referendum result. We're not trying to unpick it, and we've got to try and find solutions to the problems that have been caused without looking like we're trying to claw our way back in the EU, because that's going to reopen a debate that must never be opened again in British politics.
Well, I'd say here to that, having presented a 3-hour phone-in show every night for 4 years on Brexit, and I had enough of it as well. Anne Widdecombe.
Yes. Well, first of all, Barnier said, in terms, he spelled it out, he said that he wanted to make it as hard for us as possible because he didn't want to encourage people to leave the EU. So we always knew that there was going to be a problem. We've had Madame von der Leyen actually trying to close the Irish border without even talking to the Taoiseach. We've had Macron threatening to turn off the lights in the Channel Islands. And now we have this utter nonsense that you can't sell UK goods within the UK, by which, of course, I'm referring to the Irish border. Now, it was always obvious right from the start that if Boris went ahead with that proposal to have a border down the Irish Sea, that because of the EU attitude, a responsible and restrained EU that was going to say, as Owen has, right, okay, let's just make it work, that would have been a different proposition. But when we knew what the attitude was, it was always going to be improbable that it was going to be an easy business to manage the Irish border. And to me, it is anathema that one part of the United Kingdom is actually divided from the rest on the basis that it must follow EU rules and there may be EU border checks actually in the UK itself. So I think all that was wrong. I said so. All the Brexit party said so. We yelled very loudly, but we were told when we voted for the deal, we were told, okay, those matters, including fishing, of course, as well, will be sorted out in the course of the trade deal. Don't worry, it will be sorted. Well, it wasn't sorted. And I very much regret that. But nevertheless, Brexit has brought huge benefits. We've had a hugely successful vaccine programme. compared to the rest of the EU. And before somebody chimes in and says, oh, well, technically, we could have still had our own vaccine programme, even if we had still been in the EU. The fact is there would have been immense pressure on us to join the EU effort, as there was anyway from the Labour front benches, who said we were irresponsible not to go in with the EU vaccine procurement. Well, that was wrong. And we've had very successful negotiations of trade deals, which, of course, the benefits have yet to be realised, but will be realised. And although Andrew says, oh, trade with the EU is down, the fact is that it's gone down and up this year. And you need a much longer span before you can make a judgment.
It went a long way down and a bit up. Let's be clear what happened.
And it came up.
Right.
Andrew, I didn't interrupt you once. Andrew, I didn't interrupt you when you were on your spiel. And there are three of you spieling in favour of the EU. So just give me half a chance, please. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm hugely pleased that we left the EU. And just to finish the point about lies, the biggest lies in that campaign were told at the time of the referendum, when we were told by a coalition government, Cameron taking the lead, that if we so much as dared to vote to leave, never mind leave, if we dared to vote to leave, the economy was going to crash, and all the things that they projected did not happen. So don't talk to me about lies.
Okay, right. Imran on a tweet says, best cross-question panel ever. Great radio. More of this, please. We love tweets like that, Imran. Thank you very much indeed. Tomorrow on Cross Question, we have Petronella Wyatt, Sir Michael Fallon, the former Defence Secretary, Ash Sarkar from Navarro Media, and Sir Richard Evans, eminent historian and actually my tutor at university. So a bit of insider dealing.
Oh, nepotism.
Exactly
top,
right.
top.
But he justifies his
Should be
place,
what
I
you know,
can
not
assure
who you know.
Says a politician.
Hotels terms apply at all protected.
Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Ian Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It's 8:51. If you've just tuned in, you've missed a belter of a programme so far, but you can catch up on the Cross Question podcast or on Global Player or the LBC YouTube channel straight after the programme, actually. Right, let's carry on with another question to our panel. Anne Widdicombe, Owen Jones, Justine Greening and Andrew Adonis. Margaret is in Durham. Hi, Margaret.
Hi, Ian. How are you?
We're very well, thank you. What would you like to ask?
Good. What I want to say is, what is the point of politics? I am up to here. I have had 15 months of listening to ologists and experts, professors and politicians, and not one of them, in my eyes, addresses the main issues. They are vociferous, they are almost eloquent, or perhaps long-winded. I'd like to put 3 points to them about the main issues that really, really matter. First of all, in all your comings and goings from either house, why does it take a footballer to feed hungry children? Secondly, how does anybody in any state of influence accept the term the working poor? And thirdly, why did we give the care of the elderly to companies that can make money out of it? That's all I want to know. These are important to me.
Well, they're important questions. Bearing in mind we have 6 minutes left, that's about 90 seconds each. So maybe you each want to pick one of those points that Margaret made there. Justine Greening, do you want to start off?
Margaret, I know exactly where you're coming from. I was an MP and I left Westminster because I thought I could do more on the thing I care about.
Like Tony Benn.
Which is social mobility. I felt I could achieve more on it outside of the House of Westminster than I could inside, which is a real indictment, arguably, on our whole political system. And I felt that politics was too siloed for me to be able to work across parties in the way that I wanted to. I didn't really care what colour rosette people were wearing. I just wanted to work with people who cared about the same things as me. On working poor, totally agree. I think it's a scandal that people are trapped in dead-end jobs where they have no chance to progress, however good they are, however much potential they are. And part of the stuff that I am doing outside of the House of Commons now is working and campaigning with businesses to make sure that wherever you start in them, there's a route up. And it really matters to me because my dad was someone who left school with no qualifications at all. He was hugely talented. He never really had any kind of career at all. It had a huge financial impact on him and his family. And it was most of all just such a waste of talent. And that's why I care about social mobility, and I'm putting all my time into trying to improve it.
Anne Widdicombe.
I'll look at the care of the elderly, if I may, because this was something that I had to look at in the early 90s when I was working in social security. And in those days, that department looked after social care. And it is a massively complex minefield. And I don't think that any politician underestimates its importance. But the specific question that Margaret asked is, why do we allow people to get their care from people who are making money out of it? Well, first of all, it is to enlarge choice. If the state provides, then the state will lay down a standard, and that will be it, and there won't be much choice. Secondly, you need to share the burden with the private sector. Now, that is something that not only the Conservatives believe, but later Labour governments have also come around to believing. You need to share the burden with the private sector. And of course, a lot of those homes, believe it or not, Margaret, but I do know, a lot of those homes don't actually make very much money. Some of them do, but a lot of them actually don't. So there are multiple reasons for that. And finally, I'd say this: no, politics isn't perfect. And I'm sure we can all be very irritating sometimes when we don't come up with immediate answers. But nevertheless, most people that I know who go into politics, whichever side of the house they may sit on, go in there because they want to make a difference.
Andrew.
Well, I take Margaret to be a fan of Marcus Rashford from what she said about Marcus and the free school meals, the footballer, and I am too. And I think her point is very well made, that why was it that a footballer was able, by mobilising public opinion in a really big way, to get the government to make a change, which we couldn't bring about in Westminster, and indeed the media wasn't able really to bring about either, despite the fact that there have been big campaigns on this issue. I think her point's well made, and I would just say in response that maybe when he's finished in Euro 2020, he might think of getting into politics. I think the underlying point that I took Margaret to be making, which is that our politics is too much of a closed shop, that, you know, people go in usually in their early mid-20s, you know, they do PPE at Oxford, they go on to become special advisors, and then, you know, they live in a kind of almost a hermetically sealed bubble as they go through politics over the, 20 or 30 years, which afterwards, is what happened to Cameron and Ed Miliband and all that lot. I think that point is basically well made, and I think more people who've got really strong, well-formed views, got a real experience of life well beyond Westminster, should go in. And I think if Margaret is saying that we should have more people like that in politics, I completely agree. And it might mean that we then deal with more issues like what's actually happening to kids who basically don't even get a square meal during the day because there isn't a proper provision for them.
You went to Oxford, I think. Anne, you went to Oxford. Owen, you went to Oxford. Justine?
Southampton,
UEA. What does that tell you?
I'm very proud to go from a comprehensive in Stockport to Oxford. Thank you very much. Well done. What Margaret just asked is the most important question of all, because our democracy was hard. It wasn't given to us by the goodwill and generosity of the powerful. It was fought for. It was fought for by the Chartists, by suffragettes, by trade unionists, by ordinary people organising so that they had a voice. And what's happened is the rich and powerful have found very clever ways of gaming that system and clawing back their power and influence through lobbyists, through media outlets which are largely run by very wealthy individuals, through donations to political parties which have a quid pro quo. And the problem is we have a society where there is more than enough wealth and resources to ensure that every child in this country is properly fed and they're not living in poverty, that every single person in work isn't below the poverty line, when most people in poverty in Britain, in working households, are in work, earning their poverty day after day. The problem we have is not the lack of resources or the lack of wealth. We have the most obscenely wealthy people who ever existed, who often hoard their wealth, which was created by the hard graft of millions of people in tax havens in countries all over the world. It's a lack of will, it's a lack of courage, and it's a lack of determination. And it's people like Margaret speaking up and people like her across this country fighting to ensure that working people and children living in poverty can live in a society where people can realise their potential by not having the odds stacked against them from day one, because they can't even have enough food in their belly in one of the richest countries that's ever existed, while the wealthy are wealthier than they've ever been.
Margaret, thank you very much for a really, really interesting question. Final text question from Joanna in Hartlepool. This year's Love Island lineup has been announced. Celebrities and politicians have appeared in the past, have they? I don't know whether a politician has. Which politician would you like to see enter the villa, Justine Greening?
Well, I think based on the early conversation, it's going to have to be Andy Burnham, isn't it, with his eyelashes? And then maybe he can talk to the other guys about how they too can emulate them.
We're not allowed to objectify Andy Burnham.
Well, no, exactly. But, clearly
Well, I don't know.
like
David says here, as Owen's into men objectifying men, let me throw my 2 pence in. I don't normally fancy a socialist, but that cheeky smile gets me every time.
Well, if you're my type, get in touch. How would you know? Just a joke. Although if you are hot... No, I'm joking. Anne Widdecombe. I'd put Anne Widdecombe in Love Island.
Well, it's one of the few reality TV programmes you haven't done, Anne. Would you be up for it?
She's looking surprised as well.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, you used to say that about Big Brother, but you weren't on that.
No, I'm now going to say something very old-fashioned and very harumpish, but I actually think that programme is a corruption of the nation's morals, full stop.
But you were brilliant in Strictly, Anne, so maybe you're exactly what it needs.
That wasn't a corruption of the nation's morals, that was different.
Have you actually ever seen Love Island?
Don't be ridiculous.
Well, how can you say it's a corruption of the nation's morals then?
Because I can't avoid it in the newspapers, can I?
Well, if it's a corruption of the nation's morals, Ian, then it has to be Boris Johnson, because he has no morals to be corrupted. It also means presumably he can't be Prime Minister at the same time, so we might get a change in that department too. So I think that's my nomination for Love Island. But I have to confess I've never watched it either.
Well done.
I watched it once and decided never to again, because I thought and I like reality TV, but did nothing for me. Have I come to you on this, Owen?
I said Anne Widdecombe.
You did,
I'm the one who did Anne Widdecombe. That was the whole point.
I was just so flummoxed by her answer that obviously I need further help in chairmanship, Anne. Thank you very much indeed to all 4 of you. I have no hesitation in saying I think this has been the best cross question since we recommenced it. Thank you very much indeed. Anne Widdecombe, Andrew Adonis, Owen Jones and Justine Greening. And of course, another one will be along at 8 o'clock tomorrow.